Look at the back of your hand right now. Whatever color it is, that color is not an accident. It's not random, and it's not just how your family happens to look. It's the end result of one of the fastest, most precisely engineered adaptations in the entire story of our species, built by natural selection over tens of thousands of years to solve a problem the sun itself created. And here's the part that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it: every single human being on Earth, no matter what their skin looks like today, descends from dark-skinned ancestors. Not most of us. All of us. If you could travel back roughly 200,000 years to the earliest populations of Homo sapiens in Africa, every person you met would have had deeply pigmented skin. The pale skin, the olive skin, the every shade in between that exists on this planet right now, all of it branched off from that same starting point, and it happened far faster, and far more cleverly, than most people ever imagine. This isn't a story about one trait quietly fading over time like an old photograph. It's a story about a precise, ongoing negotiation between the human body and the sun, fought and refought independently on nearly every continent, using more than one genetic solution, sometimes borrowing tools from a completely different species of human along the way. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why your own skin looks the way it does, and why that answer is stranger, and more recent, than almost anyone assumes. To understand why, you have to think about skin the way evolution does, not as decoration, but as a piece of exposed biological machinery standing directly in the path of the sun's ultraviolet radiation, every single day, for an entire lifetime. And ultraviolet radiation is a double-edged sword. Too much of it, and it destroys something your body absolutely cannot function without. Too little of it, and it starves you of something else you cannot function without either. Early humans didn't know any of this. They didn't have a word for ultraviolet light or a concept of a vitamin. But their bodies were running a constant, silent experiment, generation after generation, and the ones who happened to have the right amount of pigment for their environment simply outlived and outreproduced the ones who didn't. That's the entire mechanism. No plan, no intention, just relentless, patient math played out across thousands of generations. The dominant theory explaining all of this comes from two researchers, anthropologist Nina Jablonski and geographer George Chaplin, who published a landmark paper in 2000 that finally connected the dots between skin color and geography using satellite data on global ultraviolet radiation levels. What they found, when they mapped it out, was a nearly perfect correlation. The closer a population's ancestral homeland was to the equator, where UV radiation is strongest, the darker their skin tended to be. The further from the equator, the lighter. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a signature, written directly into the human genome by the sun. Here's the first half of the puzzle, and it's the one most people never learn. Dark skin near the equator isn't primarily about preventing sunburn or skin cancer, even though it does help with both. Its real, most urgent job is protecting a nutrient called folate. Folate is essential for cell division, for DNA synthesis, and critically, for healthy fetal development during pregnancy. And it turns out intense ultraviolet radiation can break folate down in the blood vessels sitting just beneath the skin, destroying it faster than the body can replace it. For a pregnant woman in an intensely sunny environment with too little pigment protecting her, that could mean devastating birth defects. Melanin, the pigment that darkens skin, acts like a built-in filter, a kind of biological sunscreen that shields those folate reserves from being cooked by UV radiation day after day. In the intense sun of equatorial Africa, more melanin wasn't a preference. It was survival, quietly deciding who passed on their genes and who didn't. But then, starting somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, groups of humans began doing something no population had really done at scale before. They walked out of Africa, and kept walking, into completely different worlds. Into higher latitudes. Into places with long, dim winters, thick cloud cover, and weak, low-angled sunlight for much of the year. And that migration flipped the entire equation on its head, because now the danger wasn't too much sun. It was too little. This is the second half of the puzzle, vitamin D. Your body doesn't just get vitamin D from food, it manufactures a huge amount of it itself, right in the skin, using a chemical reaction that's triggered specifically by ultraviolet B radiation from sunlight. And vitamin D isn't optional. It's required for absorbing calcium, for building strong bones, for a functioning immune system. In a place like equatorial Africa, there's so much UV radiation available that even heavily pigmented skin still lets enough through to make sufficient vitamin D. But drag that same dark skin thousands of miles north, into Scandinavia or the British Isles, where sunlight is scarce and weak for half the year, and suddenly that same protective melanin becomes a liability. It blocks too much of the very radiation the body now desperately needs. Populations that kept very dark skin in these low-sun environments faced rickets, weakened bones, and reduced fertility from vitamin D deficiency. And so, generation after generation, in an entirely separate but equally relentless process, lighter skin was quietly favored instead, because it let in just enough UVB to keep the vitamin D factory running in a place where sunlight itself had become the scarce resource. That's the whole trade-off, in its simplest form. Dark skin, protect the folate. Light skin, let in enough UV for vitamin D. Every population on Earth landed somewhere on that spectrum depending on exactly how much ultraviolet radiation their ancestors' particular patch of the planet actually received. It's not about which skin color is better. It's about which skin color balanced two competing biological demands correctly for one specific location. Move the location, and the correct answer changes completely. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and where the science has forced anthropologists to rewrite what they thought they knew. In 2018, researchers at University College London and the Natural History Museum extracted DNA from a nearly 10,000-year-old skeleton known as Cheddar Man, discovered back in 1903 in Gough's Cave, in the Cheddar Gorge area of southwest England. Everyone assumed that this early Briton, having lived so far north for so many generations already, would have had light skin. That's not what the DNA said. Cheddar Man had dark to black skin, and strikingly blue eyes. Britain's oldest nearly complete skeleton was proof that lighter skin hadn't arrived in Europe automatically the moment humans moved north. It arrived on its own timeline, gene by gene, sometimes thousands of years after people had already been living under those gray northern skies. And the timeline turned out to be even more surprising than that. A 2014 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by geneticist Sandra Wild, examined ancient DNA sampled directly from prehistoric Europeans and reconstructed exactly when the genes responsible for lighter pigmentation actually swept through the population. 3 specific genes stood out: SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and TYRP1, each one nudging skin a little further toward paler tones. The selective sweeps favoring these lighter variants appeared to begin somewhere between 11 and 19,000 years ago. But the truly startling part is that the study found strong, active selection for these traits continuing all the way into the last 5,000 years, meaning European populations were still visibly getting paler, on an evolutionary timescale, around the same era humans were building Stonehenge and inventing writing elsewhere in the world. Evolution wasn't finished with human skin color by the time recorded history began. It was still actively happening. There's an even deeper layer to this story that appends the simplest version of the dark skin, light skin narrative entirely, and it comes from Africa itself. In 2017, geneticist Sarah Tishkoff and her team published research in the journal Science mapping the genetics of skin pigmentation across diverse African populations, from the Nilo-Saharan communities of Sudan to hunter-gatherer populations in Botswana. What they found was that Africa contains far more genetic diversity in skin pigmentation than the rest of the world combined, including populations with notably lighter skin living deep in the continent, carrying gene variants like MFSD12 that predate humanity's departure from Africa entirely. In other words, the raw genetic toolkit for a whole range of human skin tones was already present in Africa long before anyone ever migrated anywhere. Leaving Africa didn't invent light skin. It just redistributed and reselected genetic variation that was already there, favoring different combinations in different environments. Here's a detail that genuinely surprised the scientists studying it, and it might be the single best proof that evolution isn't following one master script. Light skin didn't evolve just once and then spread everywhere. Lighter skin was useful. It evolved at least twice, completely independently, through two entirely different genetic paths. Researchers comparing the genomes of Europeans and East Asians found that while Europeans owe most of their lighter pigmentation to those SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 variants from the wild study, East Asian populations arrived at similarly light skin through a different gene almost entirely, a variant of OCA2 that is barely present anywhere outside East Asia. Neither population borrowed the solution from the other. Both were migrating away from the equator into low UV environments at roughly the same broad era. Both faced the identical vitamin D problem, and evolution, working on two separate populations with two separate genetic toolkits, independently arrived at the same basic outcome through two completely different routes. It's the biological equivalent of two isolated engineering teams solving the exact same problem with two completely different blueprints, purely because the underlying physics forced them toward the same answer. Cheddar Man's combination of dark skin and blue eyes looks like a contradiction only if you assume skin color, eye color, and hair color are all controlled by the same genetic dial, turned up or down together. They aren't. They're separate, largely independent switches, sitting on different genes, shaped by different selective pressures, and capable of being flipped in almost any combination. TYRP1 and SLC24A5 push skin pigmentation one way. A completely different variant near the HERC2 gene, which controls how much OCA2 protein gets produced in the iris, determines whether eyes stay brown or shift toward blue. There is no biological rule requiring these traits to travel together, which is exactly why a population can end up dark-skinned and blue-eyed for thousands of years before the skin gene variants finally catch up, if they ever do. Evolution doesn't work from a blueprint of what a type of human is supposed to look like. It just keeps whatever combination of independent traits happen to help someone survive and reproduce in their specific patch of the planet, no matter how unfamiliar that combination looks to us now. That independence matters for another reason too. It's a big part of why the biology of human skin color doesn't actually sort neatly into the small number of discrete categories that popular language likes to use. Geneticists describe skin pigmentation as a cline, a smooth, continuous gradient that tracks ultraviolet radiation almost perfectly as you move across latitudes, without any natural breakpoints. There's no biological line where one skin color stops and the next begins, any more than there's a line on a map where warm suddenly becomes cold. The idea of sorting humanity into a handful of fixed, distinct categories based on skin color is a surprisingly recent invention, only a few centuries old, layered on top of a much older and far more continuous biological reality. The genetics tell a messier, more interesting story, a single trait, endlessly fine-tuned by geography, varying as gradually and continuously as the sunlight that shaped it. There's one more twist to this story, and it might be the strangest one of all. Some of the genetic material behind modern human pigmentation didn't even originate in our own species. When the first humans migrating out of Africa reached Eurasia, they encountered Neanderthals, who had already been living in those cooler, lower UV environments for hundreds of thousands of years and had presumably already evolved their own adaptations for it. The two populations interbred, and modern humans walked away from that encounter carrying small fragments of Neanderthal DNA still detectable in our genomes today. In 2014, two separate research teams, one led by geneticist Joshua Akey and another by David Reich, independently mapped out exactly where that Neanderthal ancestry survives in living humans, and found something striking: it isn't spread evenly across the genome. It's noticeably concentrated in genes related to skin and hair. One gene in particular, called BNC2, linked to skin pigmentation and freckling, is carried by roughly 70% of Europeans today, inherited directly from Neanderthal ancestors. It's a genuinely strange thought. Part of the reason your skin looks the way it does might be because your ancestors borrowed a working solution from an entirely different species of human, one that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years solving the exact same problem before modern humans ever arrived. And this isn't just a story about the deep past with no relevance today. The mismatch between ancient pigmentation and modern geography has real, measurable consequences right now, because human migration has moved dramatically faster over the last few centuries than human evolution ever could. Populations with deep ancestral roots near the equator who now live at high latitudes, whether through the transatlantic slave trade, colonization, or ordinary modern migration, often face significantly higher rates of vitamin D deficiency, because their skin is still calibrated for a much sunnier ancestral homeland than the one they're actually standing in. Meanwhile, populations with pale, high-latitude adapted skin who move to intensely sunny places, most famously European settlers in Australia, face dramatically elevated skin cancer rates, because that same ancient trade-off runs in reverse. Your skin is still running code written for wherever your ancestors happen to live 20, 50, or 100 generations ago, whether or not that matches where you actually live today. Put all of that together, and the picture that emerges is nothing like the simple story most of us grew up with. Human skin color isn't a fixed racial marker handed down unchanged from some ancient point of origin. It's a live, ongoing negotiation between the human body and the sun, one that has been renegotiated independently, over and over, every single time a population settled somewhere with a meaningfully different amount of ultraviolet light. It happened on a genuinely fast timescale in evolutionary terms, sometimes within just a few thousand years, which is why closely related populations that separated relatively recently can already look strikingly different from each other. And it's still, technically, an unfinished process. Skin color is one of the clearest, most visible proofs that evolution isn't something that happened to distant ancestors and then stopped. It's a process your own body is still the product of, still shaped by, every time you step outside into the sun. So the next time you catch a glimpse of your own hand, or notice how different your skin looks from a stranger's on the street, you're not looking at some arbitrary cosmetic difference. You're looking at a highly specific, still legible record of exactly how much ultraviolet light your ancestors' bodies had to negotiate with, going back tens of thousands of years, written into every cell of your skin. Somewhere in that record is a folate molecule that needed shielding under an equatorial sun. Somewhere in it is a vitamin D factory straining to stay open through a gray northern winter. Somewhere in it, for around 70% of Europeans reading this, is a small, borrowed fragment of Neanderthal DNA, still quietly doing its job tens of thousands of years after the species that gave it to us disappeared. And somewhere in it, if your ancestry traces back far enough, is a nearly 10,000-year-old man in a cave in southwest England, dark-skinned and blue-eyed, who would have looked nothing like what anyone assumed his descendants should look like. None of that is decoration. None of it is arbitrary. Every shade of human skin on Earth today is a different, equally valid answer to the exact same question the sun has been asking our species since the very beginning: how much light is too much, and how much is not enough? Your ancestors answered that question with their lives, generation after generation, long before anyone understood the biology behind it. You're simply the latest, living answer, still being tested every time you walk outside into the sun.